Today, we're going to begin the journey of addressing an important question. What does a money launderer look like? As I reflected on that question, it became apparent to me that there's no way I can attempt to answer that question in a less than 10-minute podcast. On the surface, it sounds like a simple question, but it isn't. It's my view that suggesting that a money launderer has one particular profile is as naive as suggesting that all insects are alike. There are more than 900,000 insects on our planet. There may not be quite as many profiles of a money launderer as there are types of insects, but there are certainly many hundreds of different portraits of money launderers that dig into the legitimate markets in a different way. Drilling into the issue of defining the profile of a money launderer is best addressed in a 4-hour masterclass. So we're going to take on this topic in a series of podcasts. There are many different angles from which one must assess the definition of a money launderer. First, we need to know what conduct one needs to carry out to be a money launderer. Next, to define a money launderer in a relevant sense, we need to assess our particular exposure. When I say that, I mean we need to recognize the boundaries of our employer's business in which a money launderer may exist. Like insects, there's a wide array of money launderers that can attack our perimeter when we are working within an international institution that routinely engages in cross-border transactions for clients that include global companies. Conversely, if our institution simply handles domestic accounts, primarily opened online with 4 minutes of application, our scope of exposure is much different than a typical HSBC, Bank of America, or another institution operating private client divisions and correspondent banking. Also, some of us work for non-bank institutions like broker-dealers. Some broker-dealers are global and conduct cross-border transactions, and others simply carry out transactions domestically. That difference fundamentally impacts the definition of a money launderer within a client base. Put simply, our respective definitions of a money launderer are, in part, defined by our scope of business. As we start this journey of attempting to identify money launderers, we need to start with the fundamentals. And the first step of that process is to consider the definition of a money launderer pursuant to the money laundering statutes. That in and of itself is complex because within our global communities, our respective money laundering statutes differ. I'll start with the felony of money laundering offense in the U.S., Title 18, Section 1956. In the U.S., that statute calls for a maximum prison sentence of 20 years per offense and a fine of $500,000, or if the amount of laundering by a defendant is greater than $500,000, as much as 2 times the amount that is laundered. There are complexities of the subsections of this law, but we'll stay with this one for now. Basically, in order to define someone as having committed this particular offense of money laundering, one needs to show that, 1, they knew the funds involved in a transaction were proceeds related to a specified unlawful act, an SUA. So what is an SUA? It is one of a long list of illegal acts that generate either proceeds of crime or are funds moved for the purposes of carrying out a criminal offense. To keep it simple, we'll say that in this example, the SUA is drug trafficking. A second step needs to occur for one to be guilty of money laundering. One needs to take an affirmative act to conceal or disguise the illicit source of funds. This can be a very broad range of acts, but simply stated, you do something to conceal or disguise the true nature of the funds. This can be as simple as carrying out a wire transfer or an endless act of other methods of concealing and disguising. Fundamentally, I think that those possessing illicit funds or who have an intent to conduct illicit transactions, to carry out a crime-related transaction, are people who possess funds seeking secrecy from governments. Those funds could be funds related to income tax evasion, funds related to the evasion of customs duties, fund movements to evade government-imposed capital restrictions, carrying out transactions with prohibited nations, pilfering of public funds, illegal arms dealing, drug trafficking, white-collar crime, and an endless list of flavors of other crimes. From my perspective, I see money laundering as a mosaic of hundreds of tiles that collectively compose a big picture. A person can be a sophisticated money launderer that has an impact on many of the tiles, or they can be more simply involved in one carrying out a simple act of one of the tiles. When I built the fictitious characters I portrayed in Undercover Operations, that being Robert Mazur in the story of the Infiltrator and Robert Baldassari in the story of the Betrayal, I built characters that had an impact on most of the tiles in the mosaic of a money launderer. I wanted to be a one-stop shop for my criminal clients, but every minion I encountered to affect money laundering, although they may have only impacted one tile of the mosaic, was, in and of themselves, a money laundering risk to the institutions with whom they dealt. Here's an example. Drug cartels didn't only send me boxes filled with cash. They also at times sent me smaller boxes filled with money orders, traveler's checks, moneygrams, cashier's checks, and other negotiable instruments that their workers purchased with cash. Most often, these negotiable instruments were bought in increments under $3,000 and in odd amounts like $2,345.22. So it appeared that the check purchase was made to mail a payment to satisfy a legitimate bill. The payee on these negotiable instruments were always left blank. When I received thousands of them, the name of my check cashing company was inserted as the payee, and all the checks were deposited to the business account of the check cashing company. I then wired hundreds of thousands of dollars at a time to an account of another money launderer involved in the conspiracy. Clearly, I knew the checks were purchased by hundreds of couriers engaged by the cartel simply to convert cash into smaller stacks of negotiable instruments. My knowledge and acts met the standard of proof to charge me with money laundering if I weren't an undercover agent. I knew drug cash was used to buy the instruments, and afterward, I deposited the checks and wired the funds. I was involved in a number of the pieces of the mosaic. But the couriers, or as we called them, the Smurfs, also knew the cash came from drug trafficking when they simply bought the negotiable instruments. Their acts were confined to one piece of the mosaic, but they could likewise be charged with money laundering. They knew the cash came from drug trafficking, and they attempted to conceal and disguise the cash by purchasing checks. In my undercover lives, I built the appearance of international businessmen that controlled key types of businesses that were collectively assets to a mega money launderer. Put another way, I was a one-stop shop for bad guys to have their money laundered and then put into use in the real world. Robert Musella and Robert Baldassari were senior officers of, one, a private air charter service that operated a small jet that traveled from the U.S. to countries in the Caribbean, a perfect cover to move large volumes of cash secretly out of the U.S. to countries that welcome the deposit of large amounts of cash for, quote, special friends with influential bankers, businessmen, and politicians. A jewelry store chain with 30 locations on the East Coast of the U.S. that was the type of business that could take in cash in its normal course of business. Although I added drug cash to the jewelry store accounts to give dirty money a clean appearance. A mortgage company that was funded by offshore loans from tax haven countries, another cover for disguising the repatriation of dirty money to appear as legitimate loans. A money service business I used to provide a cover for the depositing of large volumes of cashier's checks, money orders, traveler's checks, and moneygrams. An investment company, a tool that gave the placement of my clients' dirty funds a legitimate appearance when we used them to build commercial buildings or to buy stocks. And even a brokerage firm with a seat on the New York Stock Exchange that gave me the appearance of being a genuine big-time operator in the financial world. My point is, these types of businesses are cloaks of legitimacy that many dirty money launderers use. And you shouldn't let your guard down simply because a person's business profile has a diverse air of respectability. My next point is that we have to realize that the revenue from crime doesn't always start with cash. In the drug world, cash is king. But in so many other illicit businesses, cash may never come into play. Clearly, tax evaders that launder may receive unreported revenue in the form of checks, wires, cryptocurrency, or even through the exchange of goods. Don't lose sight of the fact that what creates money flow from crime doesn't necessarily have to involve cash. In fact, of the roughly $2 trillion in illicit proceeds seeking money laundering services each year, only roughly 20% of those funds start with cash. The concept of what does a money launderer look like is so complex that I've decided to expand episode 3 of Making of an Infiltrator into a multi-series. This has been episode 3A, and we'll continue this conversation next week by profiling money launderers in different types of business. I'll close episode 3A with a list of very high-risk businesses that if they are part of your employer's portfolio, you need to scrutinize with maximum enhanced due diligence. They are businesses involved in bulk banknote transactions, foreign exchange services, money service businesses, precious metals dealers, precious stones and jewelry businesses, check cashing businesses, casinos and gaming businesses, high-volume used car businesses, especially those involved in used car sales in Africa and the Middle East, companies involved in the sale of equipment, like tractors, cars, equipment parts, and computer hardware, companies operating in free trade zones, aircraft brokers, seafood businesses, global distributors of durable and bulk goods, import-export companies, trade-based finance companies, companies that sell products difficult to accurately measure. These include companies that sell professional services, computer software, broad bandwidth, second-tier telecoms, selling telecom services including stored value cards, fund transfers, and handsets, factoring companies. We've just begun to scratch the surface in our effort to identify risk. The first step is attempting to identify what a money launderer looks like and what a money launderer's business looks like. Next week, I'll begin to twist the lens and focus on specific businesses in the general world of money laundering. My hope is that your takeaway from episode 3A is that we can't stereotype the profile of a money launderer and that there are literally hundreds of profiles a money launderer can assume. What will make our journey on this subject even more complex is that of that multitude of different forms of money launderers, those bad actors can carry out their attacks in many different ways. Their degree of risk is basically defined by 4 factors. First, geographic risk. Certain parts of the world clearly are bigger players in the movement of illicit funds. Secondly, business type risk. Certain businesses are more often exploited to launder than others. Third, transaction type risk. The earmarks of fund movements, which in part is assessed with transactional analysis software, but requires so much more. And product type risk. There are definitely specific types of goods seen more often in trade-based money laundering than in others. My hope is that by the time we're done with our multi-part series of episode 3, you'll realize that money laundering is not as simple as placement, layering, and integration. Believe me, those 3 steps can be carried out in an infinite number of ways, and my goal is to help you open your mind to the fact that the only limitation to the definition of a money launderer is one's imagination. Launderers attack us from hundreds of directions, using an infinite number of techniques, but together we'll try to focus on the mosaic within which they live for each of us. I look forward to continuing this conversation with you next week. Please let other professionals in the anti-money laundering world know about my Podcast Plus campaign. I want to share this experience with as broad an audience as possible. We now have a few hundred subscribers. Through your invitations, I hope our numbers will soon grow to over 1,000. I look forward to chatting with you again soon. In the meantime, keep fighting the good fight because each and every one of you make a difference.